Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, May 31st, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine can use U.S. weapons inside Russia. So what we have been expecting to happen has happened. Politico reported on Thursday that the Biden administration has given Ukraine permission to use U.S.-provided weapons to hit targets inside Russian territory. And of course, this marks a very significant escalation in this proxy war. U.S. officials said that Ukraine will be able to use U.S. weapons to shoot down Russian missiles inside Russia that are fired towards Ukraine's Kharkiv region. They will also be able to hit Russian military units that are just over the border in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. These officials insisted that Ukraine would not be able to use U.S.-provided missiles for attacks on civilian infrastructure or for long-range attacks on military targets that are deep inside Russia. So they're framing this as just Ukraine can hit inside Russia just as part of defending itself from Russia's offensive in Kharkiv. So a U.S. official told Politico, quote, "The president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use U.S. weapons for counter-fire purposes in Kharkiv so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them," end quote. So what this means is that, if they use these advanced missiles, the rocket systems that the U.S. has given Ukraine, if they use them to hit targets inside of Russia, they need, the U.S. to give them the intelligence for the targeting information, the targeting data. So that means that the U.S. is going to be actively directly supporting missile strikes inside Russia. So again, huge escalation. And this risks a big response from Russia. We know that Moscow recently warned the UK that if British missiles are used on Russian territory, that Russia would respond by hitting British military sites in the UK. So we know there's a small number of British troops. In Ukraine. We know there's a small number of British troops in Ukraine. But they also said, and beyond. Making a threat basically to hit, British military bases. This is something, the New York Times recently had a report about this, and they said that the restrictions on Ukraine's use of U.S. weapons were put in place as part of President Biden's plans to avoid World War III. So, I guess he's not too worried about that anymore. And this is a pattern that we've seen throughout this war, is that the U.S. and other NATO countries have taken escalations that they previously ruled out, sending tanks, sending warplanes, even the HIMARS rockets when they first sent them back in 2022. That was a big escalation, something that they said they didn't want to do initially. So they keep taking these steps. And Putin just warned this week that any NATO countries who let Ukraine use their weapons to strike Russian territory would face major consequences. And so we'll see if they start actually hitting Russian territory with U.S.-provided weapons. Who knows what's going to happen in response to that. And the next story here is another crazy escalation in this proxy war. France may soon announce that it's sending troops to Ukraine. So Reuters reported on Thursday that France could soon send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers and is expected to announce the plan next week, despite the risks here. Diplomatic sources said the plan is to send a few dozen trainers at first to assess the mission, and then several hundred French troops will be sent. So they're saying that they're going to send several hundred French troops to Ukraine. And the training would be focused on demining, maintenance of weapon systems, and advising on Western-provided warplanes. The sources also said that France will finance and train a Ukrainian motorized brigade. One of the sources said, quote, "The arrangements are very advanced and we could expect something next week," end quote. So Zelensky is visiting France next week on June 6th for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Russia's not invited, even though, the Soviet Union was an ally in World War II. They decided not to invite Russia. So Zelensky's going there for that. And then the following day, Macron and Zelensky are going to hold talks. And then they're expected to announce something after that. So kind of the symbolism there to have a event commemorating the last World War and then announcing a troop deployment that could potentially spark the next World War. This report comes after Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky said that France planned to send trainers to Ukraine and that he signed documents paving the way for the deployment. Ukraine later put out a clarification that the issue was still being discussed, but France has not denied that they're planning to do this. And again, we see this report. And this was also reported in French media as well. So we know for months Macron has been discussing the idea of sending troops to Ukraine, despite the obvious risk of provoking a direct clash between NATO and Russia. And what did Russia just do recently? They simulated using tactical nuclear weapons. And they said that was a response to NATO countries saying that they're going to send troops to Ukraine. Now, Macron sounded like at one point he was talking about sending ground troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. This is a training deployment, but still, this is very, they're not getting the message. Russia launches nuclear exercises directly in response to threats from NATO that they're going to send troops, and France is still going ahead with this. And as I mentioned, it's always important to point out that there is a small number of NATO troops inside Ukraine, but nothing this size that they're talking about here. And a sizable deployment that would be public, that would be official, another huge escalation. And other NATO countries might follow along. I know Lithuania and Estonia were saying that they were into the idea. I wouldn't be surprised if you see the UK. There are British troops inside Ukraine, but I wouldn't be surprised if they get in on kind of publicizing it or something like that. And Russia's foreign ministry warned earlier this month that French troops would be targeted if they appear in the conflict zone. And, they're expected to be sent to Western Ukraine, but Russia has been bombing all over Ukraine across, in their strikes on the infrastructure, energy infrastructure and military sites. They've gone about as far west as they could. So that doesn't mean that they're not going to be targeted. And then what happens after that? So just two really crazy steps that sometimes I can't believe this stuff is happening. What are they thinking right now? Ukraine is losing the war. They have no chance of winning. Training their soldiers isn't going to do anything to help. It's just such an unnecessary risk. And Macron was one of the few NATO leaders in the beginning of this war that was still talking to Putin, that was saying things like, "Oh, we got to think about diplomacy," but that's all been out the window over the past 6 months or so. All right, so the next one here, NATO chief asks allies to commit $44 billion to Ukraine annually. So this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Secretary General of NATO is asking its 32 members to commit $44 billion in military aid to Ukraine every year. So this is twice as much as was initially floated. This is something, if you remember, I covered recently, that the initial report said that the idea was about $100 billion over 5 years. So that's about $20 billion a year. But now he's asking for $44 billion every year in military aid for Ukraine. So this would be a lot. And this is something he's going to make the pitch for sending this $43 billion during a meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Prague. I believe that the Thursday was the first day of that, and then that's going to happen on Friday as well. And so this idea, some of the ways that they're considering funding it is splitting it up the same way the budget for NATO works, which means that the U.S. is going to pay for most of it. The U.S. pays for about 2/3 of NATO's budget, so that would put the U.S. at like 20-something billion a year if this plan happens. I would be surprised. There's going to be NATO countries, Hungary, Slovakia, maybe Turkey, that aren't going to be into this plan, but we'll see if this comes to fruition here. And I think they would want to have this all settled out by the NATO summit that's going to be held in D.C. this year in July. All right, so the next one here, USAID contractor forced out over Gaza report. So a contractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was forced out of his job over a disagreement on a presentation he prepared on maternal and child mortality among Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So Alexander Smith, he worked for USAID as a senior advisor on gender, maternal health, child health, and nutrition. He was scheduled to present the paper on mortality at an internal USAID conference, and it was initially cleared, but it caught the attention of officials in the USAID's Middle East department who asked for redactions to be made. Smith told The Guardian that the edits they requested involved removing a slide describing the applicable international law to the situation for the Palestinians, and they wanted him to remove any language that implied the recognition of a Palestinian state, including names of UN agencies that include the word Palestine. So they don't even want anything that might imply Palestine as a state to be in this presentation about child mortality. So it seems like an excuse to cancel the presentation, which is what they ended up doing, is they canceled it altogether and claimed that it was outside of his area of responsibility. But Smith said that his expertise on maternal and child health is relevant to all humanitarian crises. 2 days after his presentation was canceled, Smith was told by his direct employer, which is the Highbury Defense Group. So again, he's a contractor working for USAID for this company. And he was told that his contract would be terminated early, basically told he was going to be fired. His employer said that Smith's contract would be terminated over personality differences and that USAID was unhappy with him despite his years of performance on the job and years of positive reviews of his work. Smith was given the option to resign, and he wrote a scathing resignation letter. So what he wrote, quote, USAID has always prided itself on our programs supporting democracy, human rights, and rule of law. In Ukraine, we call for legal redress when people are victimized and name perpetrators of violence. We boldly state Slava Ukraini in peppy promotional videos. When it comes to the Palestinians, however, we avoid saying anything about their right to statehood, the abuses they're currently suffering, or which powers have been violating their basic rights to freedom, self-determination, livelihoods, and clean water, end quote. So forced out for this, and his resignation makes him the 9th U.S. official to publicly step down over President Biden's full-throated support for Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And Josh Paul, the State Department official who was the first one to resign in October, he said that dozens more have stepped down quietly and that he expects more resignations to come. And The Independent previously reported on the widespread dissent within USAID. The investigation found that there was 19 dissent memos sent within the department to criticize U.S. support for Israel. So that's a whole bunch. And they're the ones who know that the aid is being blocked. And then you have the State Department say, no, aid's not being blocked. We could keep giving Israel weapons. And the people that actually work in USAID know that that's not true. There was a leak that showed that recently. All right, so the next one here, overflowing waste threatens Gaza health crisis as hepatitis spreads. So this article is from Middle East Eye. This is something I haven't really talked about too much, is just the sanitary situation. because Israel has bombed, sewage treatment plants, has bombed all sorts of water infrastructure. This article from Middle East Eye is basically the account of a few Palestinians living among this garbage, this trash. And one thing that they can't access, there's no garbage trucks taking garbage away to the landfill. So they're just piling up garbage in certain places, and they don't have machinery to bury it or anything. It's just these piles of trash. And this is about how there's a man and his wife talking about at night their kids are just being bit by mosquitoes all night, and he pretends to put some kind of medicine on them, even though they don't have any kind of bug repellent or anything. It's just these little anecdotes that make you kind of really think what it might be like for them. And it's just hepatitis A is spreading. This man's daughter has it. There's sewage, puddles just all over the place, just overflowing wastewater. I mean, the infrastructure is just completely destroyed. And this is stuff that's going to contribute to deaths, of course, if the conditions don't change. All right, so the next one here, Israeli jets kill 2 paramedics in Rafah after bombing an ambulance. So this is another one from Middle East Eye. Israeli forces bombed an ambulance in Rafah, killing 2 Palestinian paramedics on a rescue mission, according to the Palestine Red Crescent Society. So the pair, identified as Haitham Tubasi and Suhal Hasuna, were deliberately targeted while in a PRCS ambulance in the Tel Al-Sultan area in western Rafah, the medical group said, and that was the same area where Israel bombed the tent camp and killed 45 displaced Palestinians. So this is just another example of Israel targeting, healthcare workers. They've targeted hospitals, of course, ambulances, and aid workers and aid groups throughout this whole thing, and it continues. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu advisor says hostage deal is unlikely. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's national security advisor, Tatsi Hanegbi, told family members of Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza that he does not think there will be a comprehensive deal to free all of their relatives. So Hanegbi said that the initial humanitarian part of a deal that's been discussed could be reached within a few months, which could result in the release of some of the hostages. But he added that the Netanyahu government was not willing to end its military operations in Gaza to free all the hostages, saying, we're not going to stop. This genocidal campaign will continue. Of course, he didn't use that term, but Hamas's main demand to release all the hostages has been a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. And Hanegbi said, quote, the first stage of the deal, the humanitarian phase, we will be able to achieve within a few short months. It won't take many months and not years. I don't believe that this government will succeed in completing the entire deal. The government will not take a decision on stopping the war for the return of all hostages. We have to keep fighting in order that there won't be another October 7th in October 2027, end quote. And he was the one just the other day that said it's going to last at least another 7 months, which goes into 2025. Hanegbi said that there was no plan B if the hostages were not released within a few months. He said, quote, we will continue to fight in Gaza and in the north, and only then will we reassess, end quote. According to Haaretz, a participant in the meeting asked if they were lost. The way that they put it, according to Haaretz, was they said, so we're just lost? And Hanegbi replied in the affirmative. He said, correct. And Netanyahu has made clear that the hostages are not his priority, and that even if all of them were freed, he would continue the genocidal campaign in Gaza to eradicate Hamas, which is a goal that the U.S. does not think is realistic. And one important point about this, the hostage situation, is that most of them are dead. According to Israeli media, Haaretz reported back in March that Israel believes only 60 to 70 of the 134 remaining hostages in Gaza were alive. And a source said that they feared the number could be even lower. And that was 2 months ago. That was before the attack on Rafah, before more aid was got cut off and everything. So It could be much lower than that now. So, this is something you see Israel defenders in the U.S., always say, oh, if Hamas just released all the hostages, this thing would be over. But that's not the case. All right, so the next one here, Hamas says that it's ready for a complete agreement if Israel stops the war. So this article is from Al Jazeera. Hamas says that it has told mediators that it would not take part in more indirect negotiations during ongoing aggression, but was ready for a complete agreement, including an exchange of hostages and prisoners if Israel stopped its war on Gaza. So they're saying that they're not going to participate in the negotiations at all. Talks led by key mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States to arrange a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian group that governs Gaza have repeatedly stalled, with both sides blaming the other for the lack of progress. The Hamas statement on Thursday came as Israel pressed on with an offensive in Rafah in southern Gaza, despite an order by the International Court of Justice to halt its assault. Hamas said that it showed flexibility during negotiations and that it had entered previous rounds of talks with a positive spirit, including the last round, when it agreed to a mediator-proposed deal on May 6th, shortly after Israeli forces began the widely criticized ground offensive of Rafah. The Hamas statement said, quote, Hamas and the Palestinian factions will not accept to be part of this policy by continuing negotiations in light of the aggression, siege, starvation, and genocide of our people. Today, we inform the mediators of our clear position that if the occupation stops its war and aggression against our people in Gaza, our readiness is to reach a complete agreement that includes a comprehensive exchange deal, end quote. No, this is, looking at what Hanegbi said, looking at what Hamas said, it looks like there's really no hope for these negotiations because I don't see Israel stopping, I don't see them stopping what they're doing in Rafah, and I don't see them halting everything altogether. So unfortunately, this is going to continue. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and the U.K. launch a heavy round of airstrikes on Yemen. So the U.S. and the U.K. launched multiple airstrikes in Yemen, the first time the two countries launched a joint heavy bombing on the country in over 3 months. Yemeni media reported that 5 airstrikes hit Yemen's Red Sea province of Hodeidah, and that a radio building was hit in one of the strikes, and at least 2 people were killed in the Al-Haq district. A communications network in the neighboring Taz province was also reported to be targeted. U.S. Central Command said that its forces, alongside the British armed forces, conducted strikes against 13 Houthi targets in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where most Yemenis live. About 70 to 80% of Yemenis live in the areas that the Houthis control and govern and have since about 2014. CENTCOM said that it also conducted unilateral strikes that it claimed destroyed 8 Houthi drones in Yemen and over the Red Sea. The British Defense Ministry said that its forces basically confirmed that they participated in the bombing. And this marks the 5th time that the U.S. and the U.K. launched joint airstrikes on Yemen since January. The U.S. has also launched hundreds of unilateral strikes, which have done nothing to deter the Houthi attacks on shipping that began in response to Israel's onslaught in Gaza. So again, this is the first time that the U.S. and the U.K. launched a joint round of airstrikes in Yemen since like the end of February. Since then, we have had the U.S. launch unilateral strikes. They really kind of declined over the past month. I just did the Scott Horton show, and I said on that, they haven't been bombing Yemen too much. And then, of course, a few hours after that is recorded, these really heavy airstrikes are launched here, and at least 2 people were killed. Not clear from the reports if they were fighters or if they were civilians. And this comes after the Houthis took credit for a bunch of attacks on ships. I know they hit one ship pretty good in the Red Sea, and they also said they downed another U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone. So it looks like more escalation could be on the way in this situation with this heavy round of airstrikes. All right, so the next one here, China condemns U.S. missile deployment to the Philippines. So the Chinese Defense Ministry on Thursday strongly condemned the U.S. deployment of an intermediate-range missile system to the Philippines during military drills that were conducted in April and the first half of May. During Washington and Manila's annual Balikatan exercises, the U.S. deployed a Typhon. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's Typhon. It looks like it should be Typhoon, but there's only one O. So I'm going to say Typhon. It's a Typhon launcher. It's a covert system that is concealed in a 40-foot shipping container and fires Tomahawk and SM-6 missiles. The system would have been banned under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. That's the INF. And that was a treaty between the U.S. and Russia that was scrapped, that the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. And it prohibited land-based missile systems with a range between 310 and 3,400 miles. And Tomahawk missiles are in that range. They can hit targets. It kind of depends on the system. From this system, they can hit targets up to about 1,150 miles away, making any land-based variant banned under the INF. The SM-6 missile has a range of about 290 miles, and U.S. officials believe that they could be effective against Chinese ships. U.S. officials previously told the New York Times that the purpose of developing and deploying the Typhon launcher is to prepare for war with China, whether over Taiwan or the South China Sea. That's explicitly why they're doing this. They think they could hit some Chinese ships, if they try to invade Taiwan, or if things really pop off in the South China Sea. So Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Wu Chan said the deployment of the Typhon system increased the risk of conflict. He said, quote, "The United States and Philippine practices put the entire region under the fire of the United States and brought huge risks of war into the region. Intermediate range missiles are strategic and offensive weapons with a strong Cold War color," end quote. So this is really why the U.S. pulled out of this missile treaty, was so they could deploy these types of missiles to surround China in Southeast Asia and Japan's islands, and that's where they're looking to deploy them. So all this stuff, these tensions with China, this march toward war with China could be a very slow march, but this is still all happening. I know there's a lot going on with Gaza and Ukraine now, and this is something I wish I could cover more, because I always found Asia very just interesting in general, and I think it is an area that's kind of neglected, the buildup around China. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder, America's Ugly History with the International Criminal Court. One from Joshua Frank, Israel's Onslaught of Revenge. One from Lee Fong, U.S. funds Ukraine groups censoring critics, smearing pro-peace voices. One from James Durso, Will Gen Z change America's foreign policy toward Israel? And one from James W. Carden, China is eating the United States' diplomatic lunch. So go check all of that out. Go check out the blog. We have Kyle Anzalone's show there, Conflicts of Interest. I was just on there the other day talking about mainly about Gaza, but some other things as well. So go check that out. That's something I got to do, is when I do people's shows, I should mention it on here. I recorded with Scott on Thursday, so that'll probably come out on Friday or maybe the weekend. So yeah, that's everything. This is the last show of the week. You could always support us by liking, subscribing, telling your friends about antiwar.com, commenting like many of you do, which I really appreciate. Follow us on Instagram, X, and all that stuff. I will be back in a few days. Thanks for listening.